There are many moral theories in modern moral philosophy that try to explain what makes good actions good and what makes wrong actions wrong, and what people should do when confronted with a moral dilemma. These normative theories of morality, what we should do and what makes things right and wrong, come in many, many different varieties. But I think that the best way to think about these various moral theories is to put them into one of two categories at the very beginning. Either the moral theory will be consequentialist by nature, or it will be non-consequentialist by nature. And that's really kind of an easy way to divide up the world, right? Either something is A or not A. Either something is red or it's not red. Either a theory is consequentialist or it's not consequentialist, meaning it's non-consequentialist. So I'm going to begin with consequentialism and explain further in this video what consequentialism means in ethics. Consequentialism tries to answer the question of what makes good things good, what makes right actions right, in a very simple and elegant manner. And in fact, I think it's the simplicity that makes it so attractive and has made it so attractive for a few centuries now. What a consequentialist says is the following. In order to have any kind of ethical discussion or ethical debate, you have to use these four words: right, wrong, good, and bad. If you can't use these four evaluative words, then it's very difficult, if not impossible, to have an ethical discussion or a discussion about ethics. So what does a consequentialist say? A consequentialist says, all right, let me organize your thoughts very, very simply. We're going to begin with what's good in the world. We're going to begin with the good column, and whatever the right thing to do is in the world is to get us more of the good stuff and less of the bad stuff. So one way to think about this is they think that the good is prior to the right. The good in the world has to be defined first. And once you're clear about what's good in the world, then you have a very simple explanation for what's right to do. What's right to do is to produce the most amount of good and to reduce the most amount of bad. So the consequences matter in determining rightness and wrongness. So a consequentialist thinks that consequences of an action completely, fully determine the moral worth of the action, whether it's good or bad, right or wrong. And a non-consequentialist denies that. A non-consequentialist thinks that although consequences are important, they alone don't determine the rightness and wrongness of actions. So in the next video, I'm going to talk about non-consequentialism, but let me explain consequentialism a little further. So I said that the consequentialist likes to begin with what's good in the world. They'll look around, they'll say, what is good for its own sake? Or what is intrinsically good? Now, intrinsic goodness is different than instrumental goodness. And a good way to explain this difference is the following. Instrumental goodness means that something is good solely because it does something that you want, or it gives you something that you want further. It's an instrument for something else. A pen may be instrumentally good because it writes really well and it's very comfortable. Money may be instrumentally good because it gets you things you want. Eventually, you can't only have instrumental goodness, because at some point, you eventually have to stop answering the question, well, why is that instrumentally good, or what's it good for ultimately? So let me give you an example of money. Money is instrumentally good. Why? Because, or no, actually, let's start with education. Some people might say it's really good to go to college. And you say, well, why is it good to go to college? And the answer might be because you can get a good job. Well, why is it good to get a good job? Well, because then you can get money. Well, why is it good to get money? Because then you can buy things you want. Well, why do you want to get things you want? Because that brings you pleasure. Well, why do you want pleasure? And maybe that's a point where you really can't give another answer. You kind of say, well, pleasure is just good by definition. It's good on its own. I can't explain it further to you. If you keep asking me why pleasure is good, you probably never had pleasure. You don't know what you're talking about or asking about. So there's an example where everything else leading up to pleasure as your final answer, if that's one of your philosophical views, is instrumental. Eventually, the instrumental answers have to stop at something that's good simply for its own sake, and you can't give another explanation beyond it for why it's good. So I think the example of pleasure is a good one, because that really was the first attempt at explaining in a consequentialist framework what makes right actions right and wrong actions wrong. So you have the good column, and in the good column, you may have just one thing, something that's good for its own sake that needs no further explanation for why it's good and why it's desirable. The very early version of consequentialism was hedonism. So you just put pleasure in that good column. Then everything else follows from that. Once you have at least one thing in the good column, goodness for its own sake, then you have a way to answer the question, what makes an action right and what makes an action wrong? Well, if something is good for its own sake, then the right action gets you more of that stuff, gets you more of the things in the good column. And a wrong action is one that diminishes the amount of goodness in the world. So the consequentialist answer to what makes something a morally right decision is very simple. You have whatever you identify as being in the good column, and rightness is determined solely by whatever promotes more good, whatever gets you more of that stuff. And so you might think that this is pretty simple because you only have two things to worry about. One is just identifying what is it worth getting more of, and then what actions, when you're contemplating what to do, will get you more of that good stuff. You'll notice that consequentialism is elegant in the way that I explained because it doesn't presuppose very much about the world, except that human beings are built psychologically in a certain way, that we seek pleasure and we avoid pain. That may be quite attractive for folks who didn't like ethics that were based on what religion you followed, or what class you were born into, or whether you're a male or female, to determine your worth and determine your script for what right and wrong actions are. Consequentialism is very simple. It just says human beings, I don't care where you are around the world, I don't care what time in history you were born, and I don't care what gender you are. We're all essentially built the same way psychologically. Generally, the same things are pleasing. Generally, the same things are unpleasing or displeasing. And so simple psychology, you just want to get more of the good stuff, more. Okay, so pleasure was the first example. So what's good is pleasure, what's right is promote more pleasure, get more of it in the world. There were immediately reactions against that hedonistic vision of what right and wrong is. It was attractive to many people because it didn't presuppose a particular religion, it didn't presuppose a particular culture or a class system. It just said human beings are all built the same way. It's very kind of naturalistic and psychological when you think about it. And immediately people objected. So, honestly, the consequentialism framework is actually also true of what we call ethical egoism. Ethical egoism is a version of consequentialism. It's not super popular, aside from maybe some politicians, right? Ethical egoism basically says, what's the only good thing in the world? It's my pleasure. It's my good. And so what's right is for everybody else to promote my pleasure and my good. Well, what we now know, obviously, is everybody's built basically the same way. So there's no rational reason for us to only focus on your pleasure when you're basically built like everybody else. So everybody else counts just as much as you do. If you think you are so important and your pleasure and your life is so important, that's true for everybody as well. So ethical egoism is sort of the simplest, most basic, and I think kind of more primal view of an ethical view of like what's right and wrong. It's whatever, it's like the baby's point of view, whatever is good for me is right. And then you realize, well, there are other adults in the room, there are other people whose lives matter, and they're also set up so that they experience pleasure and pain. So basically, consequentialism is ethical egoism blown up and universalized and applies to everybody equally. Okay? So immediately people had a big problem with putting pleasure only in the good column because they said, look, I mean, there are many other things that are good that's not simply pleasure. And in fact, pleasure by itself may not be good if it's not deserved. Like it may not be good because if it was unjustly acquired. Let me give you a pretty crass example. Somebody might say, I don't really see why any of us are ethically obligated to promote the pleasure of a pedophile. Pedophilia is a bad way to derive pleasure. So you can't simply say that no matter what, pleasure felt by a particular person or group has to be promoted by other people. It has to be deserved. The pleasure felt by somebody who does very bad things has to be deserved and alone has no ethical value whatsoever. And nobody is obligated to try to promote that person's pleasure because it's pleasure of doing something wrong. So that's where consequentialism sort of falls apart, right? If you put pleasure only into the good column, then you can think of lots of counter examples where people will say, okay, if that's true, then this other thing's true, and this other thing is crazy. So your view must be wrong. right? If you check your answer and you get this weird result, you think the theory must be wrong. So consequentialists hear these kinds of critiques, and they're pretty smart people, right? And they immediately fold in whatever the critiques are. So a very clever strategy is to say, all right, people are saying that they object to the simple hedonistic version of consequentialism because, after all, if that's true, here's another counterexample. If that's true, that simple pleasure is good in its own sake and everybody has to promote it, then look, if somebody invents, a type of narcotic that has no bad physical side effects in the long term, then not only should we think about all taking this because it promotes pleasure ongoing, but you have to do it. It's the morally right thing. You must do. Everybody must be on this drug. So that's a clear example of a counter argument, right? You just say, if that's true, then this is true, and this other thing is crazy. So what a consequentialist will say is, I don't think that that's a killer objection to consequentialism, because what you've said is you prefer a life where you're not on a drug all the time, or you prefer a life where you're not hooked up to virtual reality and you're fooled into thinking that you're a great person and that everybody loves you. You would actually prefer to be in a world where you really are accomplishing things, not just fooled into thinking by a machine, a virtual reality machine, that you're doing these things, but that you are actually doing it. So very simple then. What's good in the good column is no longer pleasure or just simple pleasure, but preference satisfaction, getting what you want. Preference satisfaction is good for its own sake. So what's right is to promote as much preference satisfaction in a particular group or society that you're concerned about as much as possible. Okay, so then you take care of anybody who says, I don't like that definition of what's in the good column, I prefer something else. Oh, well, fine, then you enter into the calculus in terms of getting that preference satisfied as much as possible in the time frame. So as preference satisfaction is the next step up. So consequentialism is this 1-2 theory. First you start with good column and then you promote what's good. And that's what the right thing is to do, is to get you more of the good stuff. Where debates start to happen, even among consequentialists, is what do you put in the good column? Because life or choices can look really different depending on what it is that you're focusing your attention on to try to promote. So why am I saying this? Why is this relevant for bioethics? A lot of doctors are consequentialists in ethics. Ethically, they're consequentialists because they'll say what is in the good column is length of life and quality of life of the patient. So what the morally right decision is for the doctor is to get you more longer life for the patient and higher quality of life for the patient. Notice that we already have two things in the good column. And in the good column, if you have more than one thing, sometimes they fight each other, right? Sometimes you have a choice where you can either maximize duration of life, but then quality goes down, or you want to maximize quality of life, and that means turning off the ventilator after a certain point. So it's really interesting how you can have a consequentialist theory. Doctors really think very, very much along those lines because they're outcomes oriented. They want to know, if I do something now, what will happen later? So it's a very natural fit for a lot of physicians and healthcare providers. It's a very natural fit for healthcare economists who have to think about, when we the allocation of resources this way, what are the consequences? What are all the various options that are possible in the future? And then you rank them based on how much goodness is in each option. So you may think, well, consequentialism sounds kind of like high theoretical philosophy. Why do we need to care about it? Because so many of the arguments in bioethics are in the consequentialist framework. You identify what it is you want to accomplish and promote. And then once you get that, and there's plenty of argument for what's good for the patient, what's good for society, what's good for an individual. Once you get clear about what's in the good column, then the second step is super easy. It's just get more of that stuff, okay? There's another distinction I want to make. So utilitarianism is probably the most famous version of consequentialism. Utilitarianism is when you put numbers on your outcomes. You say, this state of affairs has number of benefits, X, Y, once you count up the benefits, and then you just maximize the number in each of your various scenarios of goodness, and then you minimize badness. Utilitarianism arose in the very late 1700s and early 1800s in England. And it was championed by a philosopher named Jeremy Bentham. And Jeremy Bentham, during the time when international trade was exploding, was very, very intrigued by economics as a field that was growing at that time. And he thought in the same way that we have currency exchanges between countries. So each country has its own currency, but there's a way that you can do an exchange rate. So you can kind of figure out this product costs X number of pounds in England. And then when you go to India, or when you go to China and you want to trade, you have to be able to translate that monetary amount into the other currency. So there's an exchange rate for international currencies, and that was very important for economic theory. What Jeremy Bentham thought was, for morality, is there a way to have some kind of like monetary unit, almost like kind of like a dollar? And he called it a utile, single unit of pleasure that's transferable, or you can retranslate it into other contexts. And so you're basically counting the same quantities across cultures. So utilitarianism is this idea that you can take everything in the good column and assign equal increments to it, so that you're just, instead of trying to like trade off two different domains like quality of life and quantity of life, you can unite them into one metric. And all you do is then you just count up the units of the metric, and that makes the comparisons of future states of affairs much easier, because you just look at the sum totals. You don't have apples and oranges, they're all like apples. So Jeremy Bentham started with that. It was the hedonistic version. So utility was defined in terms of units of pleasure. And immediately, people thought, I need a little more clarity here, because is utilitarianism applied to every single action, or can you apply them to general rules so that we don't have to do this utilitarian calculus every time? So utilitarianism, so the way it goes, you have consequentialism. The most developed, the most popular version of consequentialism is utilitarianism. And that's because you want to assign numbers and put everything into common units of value, so that you can make comparisons easier across your different future possibilities. Now, utilitarianism has two other variants. There's act utilitarianism and there's rule utilitarianism. Act utilitarianism is basically saying every time you're faced with a decision, what do I do? You apply the principle of utility, which is the greatest good for the greatest number of people. Okay, so for every single action you do, you take a case by case and you just try to imagine what will happen if I do this versus that, and what will the future hold? And then you use your future projections to then make a decision on what to do. The other way to go is to say, instead of doing this each and every single time, your little calculus, it's almost like you have to have like a moral mental calculator running constantly in your head, like an economist. And so every time you're running around doing your thing during the day, you have to have this little calculation going all the time to make sure that I can either buy the cup of coffee, or I can give that money to the homeless person sitting outside of Starbucks. Okay, so there's an act, and you got to run the little calculation every time. That's exhausting, right? People kind of want more rules of thumb. They kind of want more easier to use ethical theories. So you might say, as a general rule of thumb, I like to give to charity when I can. Okay, so you're not doing the little calculation moment by moment, but you have a general rule of thumb, a general principle. Now, rule utilitarianism is when you apply the principle of utility to the rule you're using. So let me give you an example of the difference between act and rule utilitarianism. If you are an act utilitarian, and by the way, I don't know like hardly anybody who actually is an act utilitarian. If you're a doctor in an emergency room, you are an act utilitarian. A homeless person comes in to the ER because they had exposure, they're out in the cold, come into the ER, and you realize, oh, this person has no living relatives, nobody knows who they are. For some remarkable reason, they have completely healthy organs. Now, in your hospital, you have 5 people on an organ transplant waiting list. You have somebody who needs a heart transplant, a liver transplant, lung transplant, kidney transplant, right? You've got many patients who could use each one of this person's organs. What act utilitarianism would say in that situation is, nobody would miss this guy. You can save 5 upstanding members of society who have long, productive lives ahead of them. You maximize the good. If the good is, even if it's pleasure, you make a lot of people happy. Nobody would miss this guy. Or you think, what's good is long life, right? So you have 5 long lives you could promote and shorten 1 life. What act utilitarianism would say is, you must harvest the organs from this person. It's not think about it or it's permissible. It's you must do it. Now, people really don't like that conclusion, right? They really don't like that conclusion. So they then jump to rule utilitarianism, which is, if this became a rule at Metro Health Hospital, that whenever somebody comes in who's in that situation as a homeless man, and then And then what doctors would do is harvest their organs. Nobody would trust Metro Health Hospital, or it would be really bad for the medical profession and trust in medical professionals. So that's really a bad future outcome. So the rule you're going to follow is don't do that, right? So the rule you're following is for an act utilitarian, it would go against what their ethical theory would say to do. But it at least preserves these kind of like rules of thumb for people to follow. That as a general idea, we have rules in place that maybe at individual actions do not always maximize utility, but overall it's best for society to run that way by following these rules. What justifies those rules? It's utilitarianism. It makes for the maximally best order of society by following these rules. Okay, so not only do we have consequentialism as the general framework, utilitarianism as the most popular theory, but then you have two variants of it, act utilitarianism and rule utilitarianism. What's really interesting about rule utilitarianism is from the experience of people kind of practicing that version of utilitarianism, they may not even know that they're doing utilitarianism, right? Because a rule might be this, one rule might be this, be a good Christian. Act as if utilitarianism is an evil ethical theory. Because if you follow that rule over the long run, then you'll promote the most amount of utility in society. It's kind of a weird version of utilitarianism. It's like saying, shh, keep doing what you're doing, even if you think you're not a utilitarian, if you think you're a rights person or human rights kind of person, right? Keep doing that because that's how you get the maximal utility in the long run. It's like a theory of utilitarianism that says, shh, it is utilitarianism, but please don't point it out because it's going to undermine itself. Which is kind of an odd thing for a theory to do. It's called self-effacing. It's like saying, you know, we're the right theory, but please don't tell anybody because it'll undermine the way it works. So that's the basic structure. We have consequentialism, utilitarianism, act and rule utilitarianism. The reason why I sketched this out for you is that if you look at an argument that somebody's making in bioethics, it may be possible that you say, oh, I see, this is generally a consequentialist argument. So which variant does it fall under? Once you know which variant it is, then you'll know, and we'll discuss in class, how you can attack those kinds of arguments. Once you kind of like know what is the ethical framework or strategy, the playbook that the person you're arguing against or the position that you're critiquing adopts, then there are only so many moves you can make with that logic that puts you into the particular category of the ethical framework you're using. So in class, we'll talk more about like, how do you actually undermine a rule utilitarian argument or act utilitarian argument. And that's coming in the future. But I just want to sketch out this taxonomy for you and kind of give you an idea of what's behind this ethical logic or moral logic. And also to point out that this is very common. It's very common for people to say, I don't know what to do. Let's project into the future what might happen under these different scenarios and then maximize the amount of whatever goodness you think is in the world or defines good. We want to maximize that with our actions. Okay, so very common way to go. I don't think that anybody is 100% all the time, every minute of their lives, a consequentialist or a utilitarian. I've never met somebody like that. I think people drift. They go back and forth between being a consequentialist and a non-consequentialist, depending on the situation, which is also very fascinating. But there are different ethical frameworks. And so the reason why you get a lot of ethical dilemmas in modern secular ethics and the bioethics is because these two frameworks, consequentialism and non-consequentialism, clash with one another. Okay, so it's really helpful to know where is that person standing, which theory are they presupposing. They may not even be aware that they're using it, but where are they to know whether or not the conflict is direct ideological or is it a misinterpretation of one of the ways in which the theories work. So thank you for your time, and then we'll turn on the next video to non-consequentialism.